On October 17, 1997, Sheriff Thomas Wilkins received an anonymous tip that would forever change the quiet city of Oakage, nestled in the interior of Oregon. The voice on the other end of the line was nervous, hesitant, almost trembling. The caller refused to identify himself but insisted that something terrible was happening on a property belonging to the Blackwood family, a name that had quietly persisted in the mountains of Oregon since the mid-19th century. "There's something wrong in that barn?" the caller whispered. "I've never seen anyone come or go, but at night sometimes I hear shouts." "They're not animals?" The recording of that call was preserved in the Lane County Police Archives. At the time, it seemed like just another rural complaint. Isolated properties often sparked wild tales. But there was an urgency in the voice, a subtle dread that unsettled anyone who heard it. Sheriff Wilkins and his team drove 40 kilometers from Oakage Center, following a winding, narrow road that disappeared into dense forests. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper, and the occasional glimpse of a fading red barn among the trees made the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. At a distance, the structure appeared ordinary, almost quaint. But as they approached, the reality became impossible to ignore. The barn was encased in chains, multiple padlocks glinting in the weak sunlight, and surrounded by a barbed wire fence nearly 3 meters high. Breaking the locks was only the first step. The instant the doors swung open, an assault of odor hit the officers. It was unlike anything they had ever encountered. A mixture of urine, feces, rot, and something indefinable. A stench that one officer would later describe as the smell of the absence of humanity itself. Inside, shafts of light pierced the cracks in the wooden roof. What the officers saw made even the most experienced among them recoil. 7 women, emaciated, unkempt, and malnourished, sat huddled on the straw-covered floor. Their ages ranged from 12 to 42, yet each looked older, beaten down by years of neglect. The police report would later classify the conditions as incompatible with any standard of human dignity. Dr. Michael Stevenson, a coroner who accompanied the operation, described the scene to the Portland Herald. "In 27 years of medicine, I've never seen anything like that." Physical characteristics immediately suggested severe consanguinity. There were prolonged facial malformations, extra fingers, obvious vision problems, but the eyes. The eyes were the most disturbing. Every single one of them had the same empty, hollow look. It was as if the soul had been carefully removed. The investigation revealed that the barn was more than a site of neglect. It was a laboratory of generations. The women inside were not just victims of cruelty, they were the product of intentional genetic manipulation, a family experiment spanning at least 5 generations. Genetic records later collected at the University of Oregon would confirm that these women were among the most consanguineous ever documented in modern American history. The property belonged to Jeremiah Blackwood, aged 68 at the time, patriarch of a family progressively isolated from the surrounding community. What began as mere social withdrawal had evolved into a horrifying pattern of abuse, isolation, and deliberate inbreeding. Of the 7 women rescued, 4 were confirmed to be Jeremiah's biological daughters. The other 3 were offspring of repeated unions between their own relatives. "This was not ignorance or accident," explained Dr. Eliza Montgomery, the forensic geneticist overseeing the investigation. "We discovered meticulously kept diaries. They documented an intentional effort to create a so-called pure lineage. The notes included instructions for selecting specific traits: eye color, bone structure through carefully orchestrated crossings between relatives. This was deliberate, it was methodical. And it spanned generations." The case ignited shockwaves through Oakage, a small town already wary of its own history of isolation. It also revived discussions about rural anonymity, community oversight, and the limits of familial privacy in remote regions of the United States. The roots of the Blackwood family's isolation stretched back to the Great Depression. In 1931, Elijah Blackwood, Jeremiah's grandfather, acquired a 200-acre plot for an astonishingly low price, $175. Lane County records indicate that even in 1931, this was considered far below market value. The reason was sinister. In 1924, the land's previous owner, John Wickman, had murdered his entire family before taking his own life. Since that tragedy, no one had dared to occupy the property. This legacy of death and superstition would shape the Blackwoods for decades. Elijah arrived with his wife, Martha, and 5 children, 3 boys and 2 girls. Municipal school records show that the children attended the local school for barely a year before being withdrawn for home education. The director of the school, in official documentation, noted, "Family demonstrates extreme behavior. Children exhibit proper knowledge for age but avoid contact with other students." The family's interactions with the outside world were minimal. They made only a few trips each year to buy supplies they could not produce themselves. A local warehouse diary, maintained between 1935 and 1940, captured the unease of those rare encounters. The Blackwoods came today. As always, the children and Mrs. B stayed in the car while the old man made the shopping. No one smiles in that family. Bought unusual amounts of kerosene and ammunition. Something doesn't seem right with them. During World War II, recruitment agents visiting the property encountered armed resistance. Police records recount that Elijah threatened the agents with a shotgun, declaring, "No Blackwood will spill blood for a government that only remembers men when it needs them to die." For reasons not fully clarified in the archives, authorities chose not to press the issue further. It was into this atmosphere of fear, paranoia, and self-imposed isolation that Harold Blackwood, the middle son of Elijah and father of Jeremiah, grew up. Documents discovered in the 1997 investigation revealed that Harold married his second cousin, Rebecca, from Idaho. The marriage was registered in 1952 in Boise, yet she was never seen in Oak Ridge. Local residents recalled Harold suddenly appearing with a wife they never knew existed. One former employee said, "We never really saw her. She stayed in the car, always wearing a wide flap hat and veil, even in the summer. Letters from her family in Idaho stopped arriving after a few years." Medical records recovered from the property indicate that Rebecca gave birth to 6 children between 1953 and 1962. All births took place at home, without professional medical assistance. Only 3 of the 6 survived into adulthood. The Blackwood family history was marked by tragedy, secrecy, and meticulous planning. Each generation carefully controlled who married whom, documenting the physical traits of offspring, choosing partners to reinforce family traits, and isolating themselves further from the world. What might have begun as a rural, insular lifestyle had mutated into a deliberate, multi-generational experiment. The barn itself became the epicenter of this experiment. Locked for decades, hidden behind walls of foliage and barbed wire, it was a living archive of abuse and genetic obsession. Every detail, every chain, every lock, every padlock was a silent witness to the horrors contained within. Sheriff Wilkins recalled stepping inside for the first time. "I thought I had seen everything a small-town lawman could encounter, but the moment I entered that barn, it was different." The silence was deafening, broken only by the low whimpering of the women. It was like stepping into another world, one that shouldn't exist. Dr. Stevenson described the women as exhibiting what he termed extreme endogamy effects. He noted not just physical deformities, but behavioral abnormalities, vacant stares, limited motor coordination, and signs of chronic neglect. Geneticists later explained that these were predictable outcomes of decades of close relative breeding. Yet seeing it in living, breathing people was a shock that no textbook could convey. Forensic examination uncovered journals, sketches, and records that detailed the family's deliberate attempts to manipulate their lineage. These documents provided insight into a mindset that treated human beings as objects in a grand experiment. There were pages devoted to eye color, bone structure, dental health, and even temperament. Plans for idealized matches were recorded meticulously, generation after generation. While the women's physical conditions were horrifying, the psychological damage was equally severe. They had grown up without exposure to the outside world, without education, without normal socialization. Their identities were subsumed entirely into the family's obsessive system of control. The Oak Ridge community, long aware of the Blackwoods' reclusiveness, was stunned. Many recalled seeing the family occasionally, noting their odd behaviors and avoidance of contact, but no one could have imagined the horrors hidden just beyond the tree line. Despite decades of isolation, the Blackwoods were not invisible to history. The property itself had a reputation that predated the family's arrival, and this combined with social paranoia to create a unique environment for the generational experiment. No outsiders intervened, allowing the family's practices to continue unchecked. The discovery of the barn, the women, and the meticulously maintained records marked only the beginning of a long and painstaking investigation. It revealed not just a crime scene, but a window into a family's obsessive, multi-generational plan, a plan that, until then, had remained perfectly concealed from the outside world. Don't scroll past this. Imagine what it must feel like to live your entire life hidden away, generations of people isolated, with their fates dictated by family obsession. Comment below if you think this story could happen today and how it remained undiscovered for so long. By the 1960s, the Blackwood property had become a fortress of secrecy, its fences and padlocks more than just physical barriers. They were symbols of a family, insulated from the world, a family that had learned to fear intrusion as much as it feared exposure. Harold and Rebecca Blackwood raised their children in strict, rigid cycles of control. The surviving 3 children were instructed from birth on the principles of the family's pure lineage program, though the term itself was whispered, not written openly. Medical records recovered decades later reveal the chilling nature of these instructions. Each child's growth and development were meticulously documented, tracking eye color, height, bone structure, and even behavioral tendencies. Health was measured not for well-being but for suitability for future pairings within the family. The children were isolated not only physically but psychologically, taught that the outside world was dangerous, ignorant, and unworthy. Curiosity about neighbors or townspeople was discouraged. Play outside the property was permitted only under supervision. Education, if it occurred at all, came from Harold and Rebecca themselves, patchwork and heavily filtered to reinforce obedience, secrecy, and the family doctrine. By the early 1970s, Jeremiah Blackwood had assumed control of this rigid system. Unlike his father, he approached the family experiment with a clinical precision, documenting the growth, health, and development of each offspring with obsessive attention. Diaries discovered during the 1997 investigation included not only dates of births and deaths, but detailed measurements, limb ratios, jaw alignment, skull circumference, and even notes on behavioral tendencies and social aptitude. Every detail was cataloged, Dr. Eliza Montgomery explained in later interviews. It wasn't just about survival. It was about control, about shaping a family line according to a specific vision like breeding animals. Only this involved real people, their lives, and their futures. The women rescued in 1997 had been born into this environment, each a product of the same controlled, interrelated unions that Harold and Jeremiah had orchestrated for decades. Their lives were contained entirely within the property. Daily routines were rigid. Days began and ended with tasks assigned by the patriarch, meals were rationed, and communication between the women was strictly monitored. The outside world existed only as rumor, danger, and fear. Books, newspapers, and radios were scarce, leaving the women without a framework to understand broader society. Neighbors who lived within sight of the property reported vague observations over the years. Brief glimpses of children at the windows, shadows moving behind curtained barns, and the occasional sound of shouting late at night. Nothing concrete ever penetrated the family's isolation. Community members recall a sense of unease, as if the Blackwoods were deliberately keeping the world at arm's length, but few dared intervene. The diaries found on the property described in meticulous detail the methods used to maintain both physical and psychological control. Each female was monitored for reproductive cycles, with precise timing and pairing intended to maximize the genetic purity of the offspring. Failures, miscarriages, stillbirths, or illness were documented coldly, often with suggestions for corrective measures in future pairings. Harold and Jeremiah's records were clinical, almost detached, said Dr. Montgomery, but what they reveal is horrifying. These weren't merely parents attempting to protect their family. They were orchestrating human lives, manipulating genetics with an obsession bordering on madness. By the late 1970s, the surviving children of Harold and Rebecca were adults, yet their isolation had left them ill-equipped for independent life. Socialization beyond the property was almost non-existent, and their understanding of normal interpersonal dynamics was deeply distorted. Marriages within the family continued, and the cycle of inbreeding repeated. New offspring inherited both the physical anomalies and the behavioral conditioning of previous generations. Local historians describe the property as a place of folklore, rumor, and unease. Even as small-town life continued around Oakridge, the Blackwoods remained impervious. Some residents recalled hearing screams from the barn, muffled and chilling, late at night. Others remembered glimpses of women working the fields, pale and thin, eyes vacant and expressionless, disappearing back into the shadowed property. Yet these accounts were dismissed as imagination or exaggeration until 1997, when the truth emerged in horrifying clarity. During this period, Harold and Jeremiah took extraordinary steps to eliminate external oversight. Postal deliveries were controlled, phone lines monitored, and local authorities approached only with calculated caution. Visitors were discouraged or intimidated, creating a near-perfect vacuum of surveillance. Outsiders were allowed minimal visibility, often seeing only what the Blackwoods wanted them to see, a family of recluses, perhaps eccentric but not criminal. Inside the barn, conditions deteriorated over decades. Floors were covered with straw that had never been replaced. Walls were blackened with smoke and decay. The women, growing older within this environment, were trapped physically and psychologically. They developed chronic illnesses, untreated injuries, and malnutrition-related conditions. Doctors later described some of these as entirely preventable, yet the family treated medical care as a potential threat, restricting any contact with the outside world. The women's eyes uniformly hollow, distant, and haunting became the most telling sign of the psychological imprint of decades of captivity. Each generation internalized the same fear, emptiness, and learned helplessness. As Dr. Stevenson explained, they were human beings, yet in a sense they had been trained out of humanity itself. The physical conditions were horrifying, but the psychological imprint was even more chilling. You could look into their eyes and see the legacy of isolation and control. Meanwhile, the surrounding community remained largely unaware. Oakridge residents recall occasional deliveries made by the Blackwoods themselves, interactions that lasted only a few minutes, and then retreat into the shadows of the property. Diaries maintained by local shopkeepers and neighbors throughout the 1960s and 1970s captured subtle signs of unease, unusual amounts of supplies purchased at irregular intervals, limited communication, and the occasional odd remark from Harold or Jeremiah when questioned. These records, preserved decades later, painted a portrait of a family intentionally keeping its practices hidden, yet leaving subtle traces for those paying attention. In the 1980s, the Blackwoods' practices began to leave more visible signs. Genetic anomalies became more pronounced among the children and grandchildren living within the property. Extra digits, malformed facial structures, vision and hearing impairments all were cataloged and documented by the patriarchs as part of their experiment. Letters discovered during the 1997 investigation revealed conversations between Harold and Jeremiah about controlling the spread of these traits, which they referred to as refinements or adjustments. The language was clinical, devoid of empathy, and chillingly calculated. By the mid-1980s, the women who would eventually be rescued were adults. Yet their world had never expanded beyond the confines of the barn and surrounding property. They had no legal identity separate from the family. Education was virtually non-existent. Their knowledge of society, culture, and the world outside the Blackwood property was minimal, filtered entirely through family control. Despite the horrors within the property, the Blackwoods maintained a strict veneer of normalcy outside. Supplies were purchased quietly, contact with townspeople minimized, and appearances controlled. Community members occasionally remarked on the family's odd habits, but never suspected the systematic abuse occurring just behind the fences and padlocks. It was during these years that the seeds of the eventual discovery were planted. The anonymous tip that would bring Sheriff Wilkins to the property in 1997 came from a neighbor who had noticed subtle but unsettling signs. Sounds at night, fleeting glimpses of women through the trees, and patterns of isolation inconsistent with normal rural life. Fear of retaliation had kept the observer silent for decades, but eventually, conscience or desperation drove the call. Law enforcement also faced unprecedented challenges. Determining culpability required parsing decades of family history, isolating acts of deliberate abuse, and documenting the patterns of inbreeding and control. Jeremiah Blackwood, the patriarch, was arrested, though his advanced age and deteriorating health limited the criminal proceedings. Harold, who had died several years prior, remained an enigmatic figure whose actions could only be reconstructed through the diaries and personal accounts found on the property. The Blackwood case sparked national attention. Newspapers, documentaries, and academic journals analyzed the discovery, focusing not only on the physical and genetic implications, but also on the social and psychological ramifications. Questions arose about rural isolation, community responsibility, and the mechanisms by which extreme abuse could remain hidden for decades. Sociologists debated how a family could maintain total control over multiple generations while eluding the attention of neighbors, authorities, and social services. The women themselves became central to studies in human resilience and recovery. While the physical anomalies were irreversible, the psychological rehabilitation revealed both the fragility and adaptability of the human mind. Many of the women, once incapable of basic social interaction, gradually learned to engage with the outside world, form relationships, and regain a sense of autonomy. Yet even decades later, the imprint of the Blackwood system of control remained evident in subtle ways: anxiety, trust issues, and difficulty navigating complex social structures. In parallel, historians and archivists began piecing together the broader Blackwood narrative. The family's lineage, rooted in the Great Depression and shaped by paranoia and superstition, had created fertile ground for multi-generational secrecy. Earlier events: the Wickman murders, Elijah Blackwood's armed resistance during World War II recruitment, and decades of rural isolation formed a foundation for the obsessive control exercised by Harold and Jeremiah. These historical threads demonstrated how isolation, fear, and deliberate planning combined to produce one of the most extreme cases of domestic captivity in American history. The 1997 discovery did not merely close a chapter. It opened conversations about the limits of oversight in rural communities, the responsibilities of neighbors, and the ethical dilemmas posed by families whose practices fall into legal gray areas for decades. The Blackwood barn, once a site of hidden horror, became a symbol of the potential for human cruelty to remain invisible, hidden behind fences, padlocks, and silence. Imagine living your entire life confined to a single place, with every action dictated by others. How would you survive psychologically, and could society prevent such secrecy today? Comment below with your thoughts on what allowed the Blackwoods to go undiscovered for so long. In the years following the 1997 discovery, the women rescued from the Blackwood barn faced the long, difficult process of reclaiming their lives. Basic necessities: clean water, consistent food, medical care had never been guaranteed, and the adjustment to a world governed by rules, schedules, and social norms proved overwhelming. Many struggled with basic literacy and numeracy, having never attended school beyond what was dictated within the family. Psychologists and social workers described the challenges as monumental. They had lived entirely within a system designed to remove autonomy and instill fear, one caseworker explained. Even simple decisions, what to eat, when to speak, or how to move in a room, were foreign concepts. Every instinct had been suppressed for decades, yet alongside the trauma, there were moments of resilience. Over time, the women began forming bonds, sharing experiences that had previously existed in silence, and slowly learning to trust caregivers and the outside world. Geneticists continued to study the family's records, revealing the shocking extent of the Blackwoods' inbreeding. Multiple generations had been intermarried, producing children with extremely high coefficients of consanguinity, physical malformations, and genetic disorders rarely documented in modern American populations. While many physical effects were irreversible, the data provided an unprecedented look at multi-generational endogamy and its consequences. The Blackwood case also had profound implications for law enforcement, social services, and historians. Investigators and policymakers examined how a family could operate in near-total secrecy for decades, highlighting gaps in oversight and community intervention. Discussions centered on rural isolation, familial privacy, and the social mechanisms that allow extreme abuse to remain undetected. It became clear that vigilance, community awareness, and proactive social services are essential in preventing such tragedies from recurring. For the Oakridge community, the Blackwoods revelation was a shock that lingered for years. Neighbors who had glimpsed shadows at the barn or heard faint cries decades earlier grappled with guilt and disbelief. The story forced the town to confront uncomfortable truths about silence, fear, and the human tendency to ignore what is inconvenient or unsettling. Today, the Blackwood barn stands as both a historical site and a chilling symbol. The property itself is abandoned, the fences and padlocks removed, but the legacy of the family endures in the stories, research, and testimony of the women who survived. Their experiences serve as a stark reminder of how isolation, secrecy, and obsession can twist ordinary lives into decades-long horror. The women, though scarred physically and emotionally, gradually reclaimed agency over their lives. Some pursued education, others formed social connections, and many worked to document their history, ensuring that their experiences would not be forgotten. Their voices now speak louder than the silence of the barn ever did, a testament to survival, resilience, and could you imagine living in total isolation, your life dictated by generations before you? Comment below with what strikes you most about the Blackwood story and what lessons society should take from it to prevent hidden abuse. Thank you for watching. If this story left you shocked, curious, or wanting to learn more, make sure to like, comment, and share your thoughts below. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that explore the hidden, the mysterious, and the true accounts you won't find anywhere else.